It's 10 o'clock on Wednesday, the 6th of October, 2021. So, a warm welcome to today's presentation from U3A Helderberg. Good morning to you all from here in Somerset West, especially our non-Helderberg visitors. I'm Richard Tompkins, your host for the presentation. Again, we owe our thanks to our studio director today, Johan Rothman, who's coordinating proceedings. We're presenting these talks on YouTube. As you know, we cannot hear or see you, but there's a live chat area on the right-hand side of your screen where questions to the speaker can be typed during the presentation. Johan will select those of your questions that could be of general interest to all and show them centrally on everyone's screen. The full presentation today is being recorded and will be available along with previous ones on our website, u3ahelderberg.co.za. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker and Somerset West resident, Clem Sunter. His talk is entitled Thinking the Future, the latest global and South African scenarios, and is based upon his newly published book of the same name. Clem is an internationally acclaimed authority on management strategy, scenario planning, and corporate social responsibility. He's a past chairman of the Anglo-American's Chairman's Fund, which has been rated as South Africa's premier corporate social and responsibility fund. And on that note, over to Clem Sunter.
Good morning, everybody. What a great pleasure to be with you. And I'm going to talk about this book, Thinking the Future, New Perspectives from the Shoulders of Giants. It's published by Penguin. It was published at the beginning of July. I'm very glad to say that it's in its third reprint now. And it's topped the chart of exclusive books in South Africa in the last month. And so it really has been a bestseller. And it's available also on Amazon, where it has done very well in the charts. So, yeah, it shows that looking at the future is still a very, very popular subject. I'd like to go through some of the philosophers who are featured in this book first, to explain how you should think the future. And then I'd like to look at some of the global issues and flags which are changing the world as we speak. And then lastly, obviously, South Africa and what the scenarios are here. So let me start with the two giants of the first chapter that we feature, Plato and Aristotle. The reason we do this is to show that there are two kinds of thinking about the world. Plato thought of the world in ideal terms. He said, you know, we're all inside a cave. And when we look at things, we're seeing shadows in the cave. But if you really exercise your intellect, you can walk outside the cave and see the sky around you and the ideal world and all the forms within that ideal world. That's how Plato thought one should think about the future. Aristotle, on the other hand, said, no, this is not the way you should think the future. You've got to look around you. You've got to take the world as it is. You've got to see what's actually happening and what is a cause and what is an effect by looking at the causal chain of events in the world, and you pick up knowledge that way. And so Plato was a down-to-earth, Plato was the idealist, and Aristotle was the down-to-earth scientist. And we can see that today on the internet. You know, you have people who are very, very idealistic. They may even be, you know, religious fundamentalists and all that, and believe that there is an ideal form to the world. And then you have others who are prepared to look at everything and look at all the evidence before they make judgments. Now, it's interesting that when I was at Oxford in the 60s, there was a philosopher called Isaiah Berlin who wrote a book called The Hedgehog and the Fox. And he was quoting an ancient Greek philosopher at the time of Aristotle and Plato called Archilochus, who said the hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things. And we think this metaphor fits very well Plato versus Aristotle, because Plato was a hedgehog. He believed that there was one view which, if you looked at intensely, you could discover. Whereas Aristotle said you've really got to weigh up all the evidence around you all the time, and you can change your mind about what the truth is and what the world is as the evidence comes in. And Aristotle was a fox. So we obviously in that first chapter say it's much better to be a fox when looking at the future, because the future is so uncertain. It can move in so many different directions, as we all know during this pandemic. There's lots of uncertainty around. And so you've got to have an open mind rather than a closed mind about the future. And that's what being a fox is about. The second chapter we devote to Socrates, because Socrates was the person who said you should never take anything for granted. You should go back to basics and test your judgments, like in a court of law where you have the prosecution and the defense. You look at each piece of evidence and you look at it very, very closely to see how much you believe in that piece of evidence. And we believe very strongly that that's how you should look at the future, by scrutinizing the evidence. And we actually have, at the end of a chapter, the whole lead up to the war in Iraq earlier this century, and how the CIA and MI6 did not question the evidence of whether Saddam Hussein had weapons of destruction or not. They didn't do it properly because they felt bound to George Bush and Tony Blair, who said we've got to go to war. And so they kind of made a judgment which satisfied their bosses. And Socrates would have said you shouldn't have done that. You should have really, really looked at the evidence in a neutral way. Which brings us to the third chapter, which features the Stoic philosophers. Everybody thinks that being stoical is just holding yourself up in the face of hardship, but it's not. According to the Stoic philosophers, they said the essence of happiness is to know what you control and what you don't control, and to optimize that world that you control, so that you can influence the world beyond your control, because there is an overlap between the two worlds. But you can achieve far more in life if you understand exactly what you control and then use it to change the world around you. Which brings on the next chapter about Pierre Wack. Pierre Wack was an expert in scenario planning, looking at the future, not as a forecast, but writing different scenarios about the future. He was my mentor, and he was head of scenario planning at Royal Dutch Shell in the 70s, and then became a consultant to my company, Anglo-American, during the 80s, and helped us write the high road and low road scenarios for South Africa. The high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement, and the low road of confrontation leading to civil war and a wasteland. And he said there are three major rules about thinking the future, which we quote at length in the book. He said, firstly, you've got to look for the rules of the game and how they're changing, because he said there are certain things which are fairly certain to happen in the future. And whatever the area you're studying, you've got to see what those points are, those trends, those rules are, so that you don't write scenarios all over the place, that you're restricted to a certain range of scenario because of the rules of the game. I mean, think of how the rules have changed because of the pandemic. I mean, we've now have people working at home, and so I think you're going to see hybrid working in many companies around the world, where people do go into the office once the pandemic is over, but they also work from home. And you've got to realize that that could well be a rule of the game in future. Another rule of the game is when you buy property. The kind of extreme weather patterns we're seeing around the world and also rising sea levels means that the risk of your house being damaged by an extreme weather event, as you've seen in California, in Texas, in Germany recently, the risks have gone up because you now have many more extreme weather events. So it's a rule of the game that the risk has risen of buying property close to the sea or close to a river or something like that. So you've got to establish the rules of the game when you're looking at the future and how they've changed. You've then got to look at the key uncertainties, because there are certain things about the future which, no matter how much you think about it, you'll never get to a level of certainty. Such as, when will this pandemic end? I mean, is there going to be another variant of the coronavirus, which means that we're going to extend into next year and have a fourth wave? No expert can tell you. It is an uncertainty. Equally, nobody knows what the future relationship between China and America are. Joe Biden has made it very clear that America is a democracy, and he's seeking an alliance of democracies to work against China, which is an autocracy. They're very, very different cultures. And so the future relationship between America and China, particularly because China is involved in the South China Sea with establishing military bases. It's just had a major fly past of warplanes over Taiwan. Where is all this going? You've got to write scenarios because it's uncertain. And then, having established the rules of the game and the key uncertainties, you've got to write scenarios, possible futures of what can happen. And those possible futures should be like movie scripts. They've got to detail the kind of narrative that could happen as a result of the rules of the game and the key uncertainties, so that you sit on the edge of your seat as you do in a cinema with a good movie. That's the whole point of scenarios versus forecasting. Forecasting tends to be very technical, and then you give a probability to a forecast, and it doesn't motivate you to act because it's just a forecast. Whereas scenarios give you good ones, bad ones, and then you have to say to yourself emotionally, how am I going to increase the odds of the good one? How am I going to decrease the odds of the bad one? In the book, we have 2 scenarios for climate change. And one of them is we call pandemonium, where we do nothing about it. And you're going to have millions of climate refugees trying to get into other countries as their own countries become uninhabitable. And you have wars over water where there are extreme droughts. So it really could be a pandemonium scenario later this century if we do nothing about climate change. On the other hand, we have a scenario called Paradise Regained, where we do everything to reduce our carbon footprint, and we create a world which is sustainable in the long run. And of course, by providing these scenarios, we're saying to people, you've got to look at your own carbon footprint. What are you and your family going to do to reduce your carbon footprint? It's not just about governments meeting in Glasgow at the beginning of November to kind of set the overall targets for every nation on earth. It's about what ordinary people are going to do to reduce their carbon footprint. We have a delightful example in the book of a young man and his girlfriend going to a restaurant, and they choose a meal, and she chooses something exotic. And he looks at it and says, gosh, that's got imported food from all around the world. Should I tell her that from a climate change point of view is not a good choice because it involves a lot of carbon emissions to put that meal on your plate? Or do I just leave it alone because I really don't want to upset her on this very important evening? So, this is the whole point of the book. It's thinking the future, not just grandly for an organization or a government. It's about you as an individual thinking the future when there is an important issue like climate change. And by offering the 2 scenarios, pandemonium or paradise regained, you get people thinking, how can I actually make the odds of the good scenario actually happen? The next philosopher we really identify is Karl Popper, who was a scientific philosopher, who basically said that, you know, there are things that are certain in the world, there are things that are uncertain in the world. There's a whole layer of probability in the world with events, and you've got to allow for the fact that some things that happen are like clocks; they tick away and they're very deterministic. And then you've got clouds which change shape as the day progresses, and everything associated with the clouds is very uncertain. And so we think you've got to put flags to the scenarios. You've got to say, what are the kind of flags to say that this scenario is increasing in probability? And what are the flags to say that this one is? So that you can, on an ongoing basis, balance up the probabilities of the scenarios you have in mind so that you can obviously alter your action if required. Which brings me to two of the most important chapters in the book. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher who in the 18th century said, "Reason is the slave of passion." And you know what? That's what's make a human being different to a computer. Everybody says, gosh, computers one day will think more smartly than human beings. Maybe they will in a digital sense, but they're never going to cry. They're never going to shed tears. Computers don't have emotion. We have emotion as human beings. And constantly you're fighting this battle between reason on the one side and emotion on the other side. That's what makes us human. And so what Hume is saying is that so often emotion manages to gain a victory over reason. And that's why you've got to be so careful when you're looking at the future that you're not clouding your foresight with emotion. And of course, that's why you've got to be Socratic. You've got to use the work of Socrates to test the evidence in a very thorough manner when you look at the future. And then the last one I want to deal with, the last chapter, we call thinking and doing. It's no good just to think the future. You've got to do things. I mean, Winston Churchill would never, ever, ever have been remembered for all his quotes if he hadn't won the Second World War. That's why people remember Winston Churchill. Our two stars in the book are Nelson Mandela. I mean, I happened to meet him in prison just before he was released because he wanted to understand the future, and he read one of my first books, and he kind of interviewed me like a lawyer, saying, why do you think South Africa can take the high road? What are we going to do to stop the low road? All that kind of stuff. It was a fascinating 5 hours with Mandela in prison as he kind of interrogated me about the future. And and when he came out of prison, he didn't just think, he did. He actually went into negotiation, and, you know, when things broke down, he and de Klerk got together, and eventually we had a democracy and we had an open election. It's because he was a thinker and a doer. And the other guy we mentioned is Steve Jobs, the guy who invented all the Apple devices that we use. And he said, the best thing in life to be is a thinker-doer. That's how you make a ding, as he called it, a ding in the universe, is by being a thinker-doer. And again, it wasn't just thoughts in his head about beautiful new pieces of equipment. He then went ahead and with a team actually invented those devices and marketed them to the public, even before the public knew what they really wanted. So, you know, this book is full of the philosophers who really should help you think the future. So what are some of the global issues that we think should be covered right now when thinking the future? Because, you know, I do quite a lot of work with international clients, and these are the things they're talking about. Well, the first one is the religious issue. It's become very apparent that it's still there with the hurried American withdrawal from Afghanistan. And you have competition between the major religions of the world: Christianity, Islam, Judaism. And that makes for a very cloudy future because, you know, it's going on. We have terrorist events every now and again in major cities. But in the Middle East, there are quite a few scenarios because of the tension there between Israel and Iran, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so if you have a business in the Middle East, you've got to watch the scenarios associated with the religious issue. The second issue is what we call the old red communist countries. Obviously, there's Russia, which has a very difficult relationship with Europe and with America because they annexed part of the Ukraine with the Crimea, and there are sanctions between Russia and America, and Russia and Europe. But of course, as we now know, Russia supplies a great deal of Europe's energy, 25% of Europe's energy. And right now, Europe is running short on energy. So it is quite crucial that they keep a fairly stable relationship with Russia because they're not suddenly going to create extra energy elsewhere. The second part of that flag is China. China is about to become the largest economy in the world. Just like America overtook Britain in the last century, China is going to overtake America in this century. And that's going to have huge impact on the world because the West has dominated the world for 1,000 years. If you go back in history, it's all about being about Western domination of the world. And for the first time, you're going to have an Eastern country as the number one economic giant in the world. And as I said earlier on, there's a lot of tension between America and China because America is a democracy and China is an autocracy. And so, you've got to watch that particular event very carefully. And then thirdly, you have North Korea, which is totally unpredictable. They haven't denuclearized their arsenal at all, despite the photo ops that Trump and Kim Jong-un have had. Nothing has changed. The sanctions are still on North Korea. They still have a mighty nuclear arsenal, which could wipe out South Korea or Japan. And so you've got to watch that particular situation as well. The third issue is around population and the fact that we're aging. We call it the grey flag. Japan is now the oldest country on earth. It has the highest percentage of people over 65. And as Pierre Wack, the giant I mentioned earlier on in terms of helping us write the high road, low road scenarios, he said in the 1980s, if Japan ever has a property crash, it will never grow fast again economically, despite growing at 7 to 8% per annum in the 70s and 80s. And he was right. Japan had a property crash in 1990, and ever since then, their economy has been relatively flat. It's grown at about 0.5%. Why is this flag so significant? Because Europe is doing exactly the same. It's an aging population. So is Britain. Britain is an aging population. That's why there's so much pressure on the national health system in Britain. America, on the other hand, is younger and more resilient, and therefore will grow economically faster than Europe and Japan. But China itself, because of its one-child policy, which it did away with recently, has become a middle-aged nation, and that must be slowing its economic growth rate. So this is a clockwork flag. It's ticking away in the background, slowing down the world's economic growth. But of course, the other big thing associated with the population issue is that we're 8 billion people in the world, and that's so much more than any other century or decade, and it's putting huge pressure on the world, on our wildlife, and of course our relationship with each other. That there's just so many of us around, and so you've got to look at the kind of scenarios that can flow out of this particular issue. Which brings me to what I call the biggest flag of all, which is climate change. I've already mentioned the scenarios, but I talk to climate experts all the time, and they say the one thing we got wrong in this century is we thought all the stuff that's happening now would happen after 2050, and we were wrong. And it's all been brought forward. And that's why this conference in Glasgow now is so important, to decide whether we're going to go negatively into the pandemonium scenario or climb back into paradise regained. The next flag is around the terrible inequality that there is in the world at the moment. Ever since the financial crash of 2008, we've seen the super rich getting back to being super rich because of property and the share markets. I mean, the American market is at a record level, but the ordinary people, middle class and working classes, haven't had that much extra salary and wage increases since 2008. And so there's this widening gap between the super rich and ordinary people. And this has created a real anti-establishment feeling amongst ordinary people. You can see it with the election of Trump. Trump came from nowhere because he harnessed the blue-collar vote in America. David Cameron was defeated by Boris Johnson because Boris Johnson headed north and captured the vote in the north of England because he knew that they are anti-establishment, anti the Westminster establishment. And through his charisma, he got that vote. And of course, Brexit was voted through by a narrow majority, and the rest is history. But in Europe, you've got many populist leaders now who are sort of saying we can't allow illegal immigrants through our borders and other policies as well. So we're turning into a bit of a populist, nationalistic world at the moment, just when we need cooperation around the climate change issue. And then lastly, the pandemic itself is an issue. And when we come out, and as I said, nobody really knows, but I do think one thing, that the vaccination has been an incredible feature of modern history. And it relates to another chapter we have in our book around Charles Darwin, where we talk about how the human species must adapt, just like Charles Darwin talked about species adapting in his great book. But we also said they have one other great quality, which is innovation. They suddenly, the human species, come up with a new product which solves a problem. And I have to say, the vaccines that are produced in record time have made a huge difference to the pandemic. And so most countries now are emerging from the pandemic, because even though the cases are still quite high, because vaccines don't necessarily stop infection, what they do is reduce the chances of hospitalization and death. So there's now a completely different attitude in the world towards the pandemic than there was a year ago. So that's how the world looks at the moment. And what does it mean for South Africa? Well, let me just read what we said in the book was the biggest rule of the game for South Africa at the moment. We said, South Africa right now stands at an economic crossroads after years of corruption and state capture, combined with the disruptive impact of COVID-19. The treasury is virtually empty, and this is unlikely to change anytime soon. We're at a tipping point where the path we take in the immediate future could define our future for decades. And that is a rule of the game. And it leads to two possible scenarios for South Africa right now coming out of the pandemic. And I'd like to read you the two scenarios. The first one we call people's economy, to convey the message that the work achieved by Nelson Mandela and others constitutes unfinished business. In this sequel, that was the 1994 general election, the country now achieves economic freedom for all as a necessary complement to political freedom. And even our scenario team in the 80s said there's two crossroads to the future. The first one is political, where we have to become a democracy. And the second one is all about establishing an inclusive economy. And we say the government creates an inclusive economy with a new generation of young entrepreneurs at the helm. And the reason we say that is because the world of work has changed. That's another global trend. In the last century, big business created hundreds of thousands of jobs, but then robots came along, artificial intelligence, all these things that killed jobs in big business. Governments no longer have the money to hire lots and lots of extra civil servants. So where is all the job creation happening in the world today? It's in small business. And small business needs entrepreneurs. So if South Africa wants to reduce its tragically high unemployment rate of 42% for the nation as a whole, and 60% or excess of 60% for young people, we have to put a huge emphasis on small business and changing our economy. I want to see Cyril going on television like he is at the moment with the pandemic, but he would actually have, instead of the medical experts on his next team, he would have entrepreneurs who've started businesses, like Discovery was started, like lots of other businesses were started. He would take the CEOs of those companies and put him on his team of experts. He might even involve Elon Musk, who was obviously an entrepreneur in the United States. But they would advise him on what is the best environment to grow the economy around entrepreneurs. And for example, it's absolutely a condition that big business puts, say, 20% of its supply chain on the line to develop small business and entrepreneurs. You've got to have a kind of close relationship between big business and small business. You've got to have a close relationship between the mainstream economy and the downstream economy, which means we've got to find out all about the informal sector and how it works. We should have social scientists actually discovering how the informal sector works in South Africa, because it has created lots of jobs, but nobody really knows about it at the moment. We quote a South American economist, Fernando de Soto, and saying that he said that you've got to bring the informal sector into the mainstream economy. We need local stock exchanges, and I see Cape Town has set up a stock exchange, but you need a stock exchange in Durban, a stock exchange in Port Elizabeth, a stock exchange obviously we have in Johannesburg, but in the major cities, so that any entrepreneur can float their business on the exchange and say, come and see it. And this is the amount of money that I want to raise. And we've got to have micro lending institutions, because the banks at the moment are not good at making microloans to small business. It costs them too much. So what kind of institution are we going to set up so that people in rural areas as well as urban areas can get some cash to open up a business? And we should also have a policy towards localization, because that will help the carbon footprint too, if you don't have to transport goods so far. So what local industries can we set up as a result of reducing our carbon emissions? These are all things which have to be thought through very carefully, not just by Cyril and the cabinet at the top, but by municipalities, by businesses on the ground. So it's got to be a ground-up revolution as well as top-down leadership. That's what creating a people's economy is all about. So I hope I've entertained you. I hope I've given you a feeling for how to think the future. Don't try and forecast the future with a single line and put probabilities on that. That just doesn't really work. What you have to do is look at the good and the bad scenarios on most things, and then do everything you can to increase the probability of the good scenario, which means engaging your emotion as well as your reason. And don't forget that point I made about thinking and doing. It's not just about thinking the future, it's about going and doing it. And you know, it's something that politicians can learn, but so many other people should learn, is that words don't matter. It's action that counts. So it's a powerful message. I've told you about the world. The world's in a difficult place at the moment because of the anti-establishment populist feeling. We've got all the rich nations retiring into their own little gilded cages, and then we've got the rest of the world. How can we readopt that globalization that we had in the last century that opened up the movement with freedom of goods and freedom of people? How can we get back to that kind of world? It's a really important challenge at the moment. And for South Africa, how can we use this moment at the end of the pandemic to create this people's economy? Because you can't just change politics into a democracy. You've then got to do something about the economy. And I'd like to leave you with a benediction for all of you listening to me so that you can go and do something about it. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Hello?
Clem, there's a question on the screen now.
Oh, yes. The question is, Africa is a continent of young people. What does its future look like? The answer is that Africa is the youngest continent on Earth. But there are two things required for fast economic growth, which is decent government that actually believes in the kind of principles of entrepreneurship that I talked about, and obviously decent government in the sense of creating the infrastructure required by business to expand. When I did a session in 2006 in Beijing at the Central Party School, which is the leadership academy for the Chinese Communist Party, they showed me around the school afterwards, and they'd taken down all the slogans of Mao Zedong on the wall and replaced them with slogans of Deng Xiaoping, who followed Mao as president of China. And I said to one of the professors, why is it that you've done this? And he said, because Deng taught us two things. He said, you've got to let the government create a sound infrastructure, a platform on which business can grow, and then you've got to allow ordinary Chinese to create wealth for themselves. And he said those two principles meant we went from the 100th ranked economy in 1978 to number 5 today. And of course, they're number 2 and could become number 1. And in a sense, what worries me about Xi Jinping, the latest premier of China, is that he's tending to go back to Mao in terms of reasserting the authority of the Communist Party. And I don't know how much that's going to interfere with the kind of country that Deng basically shaped with those two principles. But the point is this, is that old-fashioned socialism doesn't work. Russia is still an average economy, so is Cuba. Venezuela is a disaster. So the style of government in Africa is just as important as whether a country has a young population or not. So essentially, you've got to look at Africa country by country, look at the kind of political scenarios for their countries, and see whether the chances of a high road for that country are high or low because of the way politics is practiced in that country. Because some African countries are still autocracies, they're dictatorships, and you don't have a great future in a dictatorship. It's going to be interesting to see, what Afghanistan's future over the next 10 years is as a result of Taliban rule, because certainly in the 95 to 2000 period that they previously ruled Afghanistan, they did it in a very despotic way. Any other questions?
Yes, the next one is there.
Yeah, it's about as long as Ramaphosa and the ANC persist in EWC and NHI and the NDR, now, what hope is there for economic prosperity? Well, that is the whole point of why Cyril now has to create another sort of committee of experts like he had for the pandemic, which I think he's handled pretty well. And I think South Africa is also rising out of the pandemic. He's got to do exactly the same for the recovery. And I know that he feels that NEDLAC and the talks between government and NEDLAC will, lead to that. But, it's pretty inconclusive and abstract stuff. I want to have people who really understand what it's like to create a business and operate it to come forward and be on this panel. And of course, the same applies to the long-term future of our national health. We really need people who understand how to run a good hospital, because the crazy thing about this country is that we have some incredibly good hospitals here, as good as anywhere else in the world. You have departments within state hospitals which are incredibly good. So we have all this talent. We just haven't put it together promptly. And I have to say, what that dreadful 2 days of looting that we recently had, where a lot of malls were sabotaged, showed the bad side. But the good side was the pushback by the communities in the way that they protected other property that hadn't been damaged, but secondly, in the cleanup operation itself. It showed the bad side and then the good side of South Africa. So I still think we have a major chance of taking the people's economy scenario and following that route. But it does require some very major changes to how we run the economy. And the principal factor is that the entrepreneur becomes the most important issue. Look at America. Why is America the number one nation on earth at the moment? It's not because of their politicians, even though they've had people like George Washington and others. It's because they had people like Henry Ford, who came up with the first car that could be mass produced. We had Walt Disney with the cartoons. We had Bill Gates with computer operating systems, and Steve Jobs. That is what has made America the great economy that it is today. So we've got to do the same in South Africa. It's all a question of creating the entrepreneurs. Is there a website to find out about entrepreneurial projects that are in progress in South Africa? I haven't seen one. There may well be one, but I haven't seen it. And that's one of the problems, is that the newspapers spend all their time talking about the ANC and the EFF and the DA and local elections and all that kind of stuff. They don't actually cover this side, which is such a shame, because that's the future of South Africa. So I would love to know if there was a website, and if there isn't one, there should be one that is actually set up and which Cyril contributes to, and people like Adrian Gore and other major leaders in South Africa contribute to, so that we can have the same kind of focus on that as we seem to have on the politics of this country. What is the view of the Western Cape separating from South Africa? Look, I don't think that's a good idea. Like, I didn't think that Brexit was a good idea for Britain, and I think they've still got hard times to come because there are just so many bureaucratic things in place between Europe and Britain now, which just didn't exist 6 months ago. And they're running into shortages of truck drivers for Christmas. They're going through an energy crisis. They're going through a food crisis as well. We live in an interdependent world. And for me, the idea that the Western Cape can become its own economy and then have kind of borders and passports and all the other bureaucratic kind of stuff that goes with it. No ways. Western Cape is much better in South Africa, and obviously using its clout to transform the entire South African economy. And I have to say, it's important that South Africa remains part of two very important groups: the South African SADC, the Southern African countries, and secondly, BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's really important that we stay in play as an international player, because there's lots of products we produce in South Africa that we want to trade freely with the rest of the world. We don't want the kind of restrictions which unfortunately could come into play because of the populism and nationalism in the world today. My view on the upcoming elections, this is an interesting one. I think that the playing field is very open at the moment, and I'm going to be very interested to see whether Cyril is actually turning the image of the ANC around, because last time they actually lost about 10% of the vote in the local election, because obviously Zuma did not appeal to voters at that time. It'll be interesting to see how much Cyril, even though he's a fairly quiet, reserved campaigner, see how much he actually turns it around for the ANC. The DA have started off with a very powerful campaign, and I'm sure they're going to do well in the Western Cape. And the EFF is the unknown factor, and how many young people are going to be persuaded by Julius Malema's charisma to support the EFF. And then, of course, after the election is over, we'll have the interesting situation that we had in the last municipal election, that you get the most extraordinary coalitions in municipalities, sometimes between the DA and the EFF, so that the municipality can run properly. But I come back to my point that the one great thing that looting showed us 2 months ago is that at street level, ground level, South Africa can operate as a team to get things done. And so I hope whatever the municipal election result, we operate as a team to change the local economy so that it can start really firing on all cylinders, because it now has a new generation of entrepreneurs. I'm told that was the last question. So thank you very much. Do go and buy this book. It's available at Exclusive Books and other bookshops. As I said, it was actually the #1 in Exclusive in last month. I've got a photograph from a lady in Johannesburg which showed it. And yeah, it's doing very well on Amazon as well in the Kindle version. So, you know, all the ideas that I put forward are available in this relatively short and easy to read book. Thank you very much, and may the fox be with you.
Well, that seems to have been the last question, so it concludes today's presentation. Thank you very much indeed, Clem, giving us some of your time today for such a thought-provoking, positive attitudes and interesting motivational talk. Good luck with the book sales. Please join us again on our usual first Wednesday of the month, this being the 3rd of November at 11 a.m. Repeat, 11 a.m., which is an hour later than usual. And the speaker will be microbiologist Dr. Jennifer Thompson on the topic of genetically modified crops. Obviously controversial, so it should be an interesting presentation. Until then, goodbye from U3A Helderberg.